bamboo forests hold a kind of silence that feels older than language, older even than the breath of human longing. In their emerald corridors, every shift of light carries secrets, and every gust of wind whispers of realms unseen. It is here, in this quiet place, where shadows soften into dreams, that her myth begins. Not with thunder, nor flame, nor divine proclamations, but with a glow, faint as a memory, trembling inside the hollow of a single stalk. The forest had always been serene, but that night, something in its stillness felt different, tinged with a sweetness the old wood had never known. It was as if the air itself leaned in, expectant, waiting for a miracle it dared not name. Before she appeared, the world was loyal to its rhythms. Days passed like beads on a string, predictable and unbroken. But miracles do not respect the ordinary, and the night Kaguya-hime arrived, the moon rose heavier, luminous as longing, brushing silver over the bamboo leaves until they glittered like soft feathers. The old bamboo cutter, weary from years of repetition, had walked these paths countless times, but this night he felt something pull at him, something tender, almost shy. It was not fear. It was a beckoning, a promise of beauty so delicate it might vanish if he exhaled too deeply. He followed it without understanding why. The glow came from a bamboo stalk, thinner than his wrist, yet the light inside it pulsed gently, as though breathing. He approached slowly, each step sinking into moss that cushioned the moment with reverence. When he touched the stalk, it warmed beneath his fingertips, alive in a way no plant should be. The blade of his knife trembled as he sliced it open, and from within the slit of green emerged a radiance like moon water, soft and tremulous. There, curled within the light, was a girl no larger than his hand. She did not cry, she did not startle. She simply looked at him with eyes too calm for a human child, eyes that shimmered with something ancient and sorrowful, as if she already understood that the world she had entered would never be able to keep her. He carried her home as though she were made of breath, afraid she might dissolve into mist if he held her too tightly. His wife, startled by the glow in his arms, felt her heart swell with a tenderness she had thought time had eroded from her. Together, they placed the tiny girl on soft cloth, and in a moment that felt more like magic than growth, she expanded in size, first to a toddler, then a young child, then a girl, delicate as a whisper. Her hair slid down her back like a ribbon of polished night. Her skin held a faint luminescence, as if the moonlight had followed her indoors and refused to let go. She exuded an unspoken grace, the kind that made the air hush whenever she moved.
People often speak of beauty as something to admire, but hers demanded reverence. Even before she stepped into womanhood, something about her shifted the balance of the world around her. Flowers near her home bloomed out of season. The wind behaved strangely, gentler, as if fearing it might bruise her cheeks. Birds perched closer than they should, entranced, forgetting to flutter away. She walked through the village with modesty, yet every heartbeat around her quickened. She laughed softly, and the day warmed. She sighed, and sunset seemed to arrive a little earlier. Her presence softened the world, but beneath its tenderness lay an ache, an unspoken warning that she did not truly belong to any place hands could touch. Children sensed it first. They loved her, yet none of them ever reached for her hand. They watched her from a respectful distance, as if instinct told them that touching her would break something too fragile to mend. Elders who met her gaze felt a strange nostalgia, the kind that arrives with the scent of something half-remembered. They whispered to each other that she carried the moon in her eyes, that she had stepped into the world already mourning something she had lost before she was born. No one dared to question her origins. Wonder eclipsed curiosity, and longing softened every suspicion into reverence. The bamboo cutter and his wife adored her, yet even they sensed the fragile veil that surrounded her. At night, they sometimes found her sitting alone by the window, her face turned toward the moon, as though listening to a voice only she could hear. Her expression wasn't sad, yet it carried a tenderness so sharp it bordered on sorrow. When they asked what she watched, she simply smiled and returned to them, but the moonlight clung to her skin as though reluctant to let her go. Every night, the same ritual, the same quiet yearning. It became clear that whatever called to her did not belong to the human world. Seasons passed, and she bloomed into womanhood with a radiance that cities would one day sing about. Yet the forest remained her truest companion. Whenever she walked beneath the bamboo canopy, the leaves leaned toward her, shimmering like lovers held captive by admiration. The scents of earth and moss braided themselves into her sleeves, and the hush of the woods wrapped her like an embrace. It was as though the forest recognized her, not as an intruder, but as a long-lost daughter. And she, in return, moved through it with an intimacy that felt almost sacred. Despite her quiet nature, her presence left ripples behind her, small but undeniable. Water in the village wells tasted sweeter. Lantern flames flickered brighter when she passed. Infants stopped crying in her arms. Strangers who glimpsed her felt briefly lifted, as though brushing against a fragment of a dream they had forgotten upon waking. Even the coldest hearts softened near her, though few understood why. She didn't speak often, but when she did, her voice settled into the listener like a warm tide at dusk, soothing and stirring in equal measure. She belonged to the world, yet she remained apart from it, wrapped in an invisible melancholy as delicate as frost. Rumors soon began to weave around her, stories spoken in hushed tones so as not to offend whatever divinity might be listening. Some claimed she had been born from moonlight trapped in bamboo. Others believed she was a wandering spirit, a dream that had taken human shape to soothe a lonely world. A few whispered she was a blessing sent to the bamboo cutter for his kindness, though even they felt that the gift was too wondrous to be so simply explained. No one knew the truth. The mystery only deepened her allure. And yet beneath every myth and whispered tale, one thing remained certain. She was not entirely of this earth. Her stillness held the weight of distant stars. Her smile shimmered with the shimmer of tides pulled by lunar longing. Her silence especially told stories. Stories of nights far above mortal comprehension, of silver-lit realms, of a home she had left behind but had never truly escaped. Every time she gazed at the moon, the world felt a little less solid around her, as though she might rise weightlessly if the night grew quiet enough. From the moment she entered the world, something in its rhythm shifted. Time no longer flowed as it should. Longing seeped into the very soil, tender and aching. She was beauty incarnate, yet her beauty carried a warning. Nothing so enchanting could remain forever. Her presence brought serenity, yes, but also a gentle sorrow, as though every breath she took reminded her and all who saw her that she was only passing through. She was a miracle, yes, but also a prelude to heartbreak. And even in the beginning, before destiny unfurled its cruel tenderness, one could feel it, the soft, inevitable ache of a love impossible to hold. From the moment Kaguya-hime began to move through the world with the grace of a young woman, the air around her seemed to change its very temperament. She walked as though gravity treated her differently, as if each step brushed lightly against the earth rather than pressed into it. Light behaved strangely in her presence. It softened, warmed, bent around her in gentle halos that clung to her silhouette like a lover reluctant to release its embrace. At dawn, sunlight filtered through the bamboo lattice of her home and caught on her hair, turning the strands into shimmering threads of midnight. At dusk, lanterns flickered toward her, as though trying to memorize the curve of her cheek before the darkness swallowed it. Even moonlight, her most faithful companion, wrapped her in a glow too tender to be born of cold celestial stone. There was a calmness in her that unsettled even the most hardened hearts. It was not the calm of someone content, nor the tranquility of one who has accepted the world as it is. Her stillness felt like waiting, like listening to a voice carried across great distances, a voice only she could hear. When she sat in a room, silence thickened around her in reverent layers, and the softest sigh of her breath seemed enough to stir every emotion sleeping inside the people near her. She did not speak often, yet every word she offered entered the listener with a warmth that lingered long after her lips fell silent. Her presence was a blessing, and yet it carried the faint tremble of a promise that would one day break. The bamboo cutter, her foster father, remained the first and most faithful witness to her radiance. He had aged in the years since her arrival, but whenever she stepped near him, the weariness on his face loosened, replaced with a gentle awe he could not conceal. His hands, rough from decades of labor, trembled slightly when he brushed stray leaves from her sleeves, not because he feared she would shatter, but because he feared he might. He often found himself studying her profile when she wasn't looking, the delicate slope of her nose, the serene plane of her brow, the faint luminosity that clung to her skin as though she were made of breath and moon dust. She was a miracle he never dared to claim as his own, though she called him father with the softness of genuine affection. Yet even in those tender moments, he felt a distance in her, the kind that belonged to horizons rather than people. His wife, gentle and patient, loved Kaguya-hime with a devotion bordering on sacred. She saw in the girl a daughter she had once feared she would never have, a quiet dream she had buried in her heart long ago. But love, even maternal love, can tremble beneath the weight of the extraordinary. She often woke in the middle of the night to find Kaguya-hime gazing at the moon from the Engawa, her figure wrapped in silver like a celestial silhouette carved out of light. The older woman would watch from the shadows, torn between approaching and letting her be, sensing that the girl belonged more to that distant orb than to her own embrace. Still, she prepared Kaguya-hime's kimonos with meticulous care, choosing colors that echoed the soft palette of dawn or the muted gold of autumn leaves. Dressing her felt like tending to a sacred offering. Every fold, every tied sash whispered of love and fear intertwined. The villagers, for their part, reacted to Kaguya-hime in a tapestry of emotions that revealed more about themselves than about her. Some approached her with reverence. They bowed deeper, smiled softer, spoke in hushed voices. They believed she brought fortune simply by existing, that her presence drew blessings from places unseen. Mothers who struggled with sick children brought them near her home, not to bother her, but in hopes that even the faintest trace of her serenity might lend their babies strength. Farmers whispered that their crops grew better the year she came of age. Fishermen claimed the river shimmered brighter when she passed near it. These were simple people, but their instincts rarely lied. She radiated something unearthly, and its warmth softened the edges of their lives. Others responded to her with confusion, even fear, not because she ever harmed them, she never did, but because beauty so profound can feel like an omen when one has never known anything like it. They could not look at her for too long. Something in her eyes unsettled them, not because it was harsh, but because it was impossibly gentle. Those eyes felt ancient, like windows to a place they were not meant to enter. Some avoided her altogether, offering stiff greetings and retreating quickly, as though a prolonged glance might reveal truths they were not ready to face. They felt that her presence was too perfect, too fragile, too temporary. And fear often grows where impermanence lingers. But the most potent reactions came from the young men of the village, and later from far beyond it. They were the ones most susceptible to the yearning she inspired. They watched her with an ache they did not know how to articulate, drawn to her the way moths are drawn to the moon rather than the flame. She never flirted, never encouraged, never promised anything. Yet her silence, her soft glances, the way she lowered her eyelids when pondering something unseen, these subtle movements captured hearts before the young men even realized they were falling. They admired her from afar, almost reverent in their distance, as though stepping too close might shatter the delicate tranquility wrapped around her like a veil.
One young man, the son of a woodworker, was among the first to confess his affection, though he did so indirectly.
He carved small gifts, tiny animals, miniature lanterns, a delicate comb, and left them near her doorstep, never revealing his identity. Kaguya-hime accepted them with polite gratitude, but her eyes always held the distant reflection when she ran her fingers along the carvings. It was not dismissal, but a gentle sadness, the kind that accompanied every act of affection directed toward her. She cherished the gesture, but could not return the emotion he hoped for. When the young man realized this, he did not resent her. Instead, he admired her all the more, as though heartbreak itself became a tribute to her inexplicable purity. Another admirer, bold and impulsive, once tried to approach her directly. He stepped into her path, breath unsteady, words trembling on his lips. But the moment she lifted her gaze to meet his, something in him faltered. Her eyes were soft, kind even, but behind them lay a distance so vast he felt himself standing at the edge of an abyss carved from yearning and moonlight. She offered him a small smile, gentle, apologetic, and the young man stepped aside, realizing that whatever he sought from her could never be received in the way he desired. Her stillness contrasted sharply with the fire of his longing, and in that contrast he understood the futility of his desire. Even those who felt no romantic pull toward her could not deny the quiet power she held over their emotions. Her presence soothed tempers before arguments could erupt. Children stopped crying when she entered a room. Animals approached her without fear, pressing their noses into her palm as though recognizing a kindred gentleness. The village became calmer, softer, almost enchanted, simply because she existed within it. Kaguya-hime herself remained unaware, or perhaps unconcerned, about the effect she had on others. She moved through her days with a serene detachment, offering kindness where appropriate, silence where necessary, and always that faint, lingering sadness that felt like the shadow of a place no one else could perceive. She was surrounded by longing, yet untouched by it, adored, yet unreachable, cherished, yet destined to remain apart. And in this contrast, her stillness against their yearning, her myth grew richer, more intoxicating. The world desired her, but she belonged to a distant silence. The world reached for her, but she remained wrapped in moonlight. The world loved her, but she was never meant to stay.
Conflict did not arrive in a single moment, nor did it erupt like storms that tear through the sky with blinding violence. It crept quietly, like mist slipping between bamboo stalks at dawn, soft, subtle, inevitable. Kaguya-hime had lived among mortals long enough that their yearning began to gather around her like an invisible tide. It began with glances that lingered too long, breaths that caught in throats, the way conversations fell silent when she entered a room. None of this startled her. She had always inspired such reactions. Yet now, as she blossomed fully into womanhood, the longing directed toward her grew warmer, closer, almost tangible. It pressed against her in ways she could feel but never reciprocate, like hands reaching through water toward a reflection that vanished upon touch. She sensed it most keenly when she was alone in the bamboo forest, where moonlight filtered through the leaves in fragile ribbons. The air around her seemed to hum faintly, vibrating with all the unspoken desires she carried with her, desires she could not return. She often touched the nearest bamboo stalk and closed her eyes, letting her fingers glide over its smooth surface. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine what it might feel like to be held, not as a miracle, not as a celestial enigma, but simply as a woman. But the thought always dissolved into an ache so sweet and sharp it felt like swallowing moonlight. The old bamboo cutter began to notice the change before anyone dared to say it aloud. He watched the procession of young men arriving with gifts, poems, or trembling declarations, each of them convinced that their sincerity would be enough to win her heart. Some brought her rare fabrics, or cups carved from fragrant wood. Others recited verses written through sleepless nights, hoping their words might touch the edges of her quiet sorrow. A few knelt before her with raw yearning flickering behind their eyes. She greeted each with grace, offering soft smiles that kindled hope even as they extinguished it. She never rejected them cruelly. Her refusals were gentle, phrased as though spoken from a place beyond desire. But no matter how tender her voice, her answer was always the same. She could not give them what they sought. Her father tried to shield her from the pressure, suggesting she remain inside when suitors gathered. But Kaguya-hime refused to hide. Doing so felt dishonest. She accepted the gifts with humility, not letting even a tremor betray the growing ache within her. What pained her most was knowing that she could inspire such longing and yet remain untouched by it. She was trapped between worlds, desired by the one she lived in, claimed by the one that awaited her.
Among the many who sought her affection, one man stood apart, not because his gifts were finer, but because he did not seek to impress her with extravagance. He came often, never unannounced, always pausing at the threshold as though waiting for permission from the air itself before approaching her. He was a quiet man, gentle in manner, with eyes that carried more sincerity than expectation. He never reached out to touch her, never pressed his desires upon her. Instead, he sat nearby while she tended the garden, speaking softly of trivial things, the color of the leaves that season, the sound of the river during heavy rains, memories of his childhood. His presence was soothing, like warm light filtering through fog. Kaguya-hime found it easy to speak with him. She felt no pressure in his gaze, no hunger veiled behind politeness. He admired her, yes, but not with the desperate desire that others carried. He looked at her as though she were a melody he could never learn, but loved listening to anyway. And that frightened her more than the bold suitors, because his tenderness was the closest thing to comfort she had ever known. There were moments, fleeting, dangerous moments, when she imagined what it would be like to let herself seek warmth in another heart. When the breeze stirred her hair and he brushed a stray strand from her face, she felt a shiver ripple through her, gentle yet devastating. He had not meant it as intimacy. It had been a simple gesture, instinctive and kind, but the whisper of his fingertips lingered against her skin long after his hand pulled away, awakening something inside her that felt perilously close to desire. But each time she allowed herself to drift toward that sweetness, something intervened, a sensation like distant bells ringing just beyond human hearing, a tug at the edges of her soul. It reminded her that she belonged to a place far from this world, a place with laws older than longing. The moon had begun to call to her, not through sound, but through a pull she felt deep within her chest. Sometimes she would pause mid-sentence, as though hearing someone speak her name from the sky. Her eyes drifted upward instinctively, and the faint light in them shifted, revealing a sorrow so profound that even the gentle young man fell silent at the sight.
He never asked why she looked at the moon with such yearning, but he felt the distance growing between them long before she spoke of it. He sensed that she was slipping away like water through cupped hands, and he hated how helpless he was to stop it. When he walked home after their quiet meetings, his chest felt hollow, heavy with the knowledge that loving her was an invitation to a heartbreak he would willingly accept. Her adoptive parents, too, began to feel the unspoken truth settling around them. They noticed the nights she could not sleep, the way she wandered the garden with bare feet, letting the cool earth seep into her skin as if grounding herself against the celestial pull. They saw how often she paused at the doorway, staring at the sky with quiet dread. Her mother would sometimes take her hand, feeling the faint tremble beneath her fingers. Kaguya-hime would smile, reassuring her, but her eyes betrayed a grief she could not conceal. She was being called home. The conflict grew steadily, weaving itself into every tender moment she shared with those around her. She longed to give them something real, something warm, tangible, human. She longed to rest her head on her mother's lap without feeling the moon tug at her thoughts. She longed to walk beside the gentle young man and let herself be held, even once, even briefly. But each longing carried the sting of impossibility. Her destiny was not hers to choose. She could feel the invisible threads pulling tighter with every passing night. The sensual tension deepened, not through physical closeness, but through the spaces where closeness almost happened. A hand that hovered near hers but did not touch. A breath shared across a small distance that felt larger than lifetimes. A glance that lingered too long, then broke abruptly as the sky dimmed and called her name in silence. These moments were heavier than embraces, more intimate than kisses. They were filled with all the things she wished she could want, and all the reminders that she could never have them. And so, the village, the forest, the moonlit nights, all became stages for a desire that could never bloom. Their yearning reached for her like vines seeking light, but she was made of reflections, slipping through fingers
no matter how gently they tried to hold her. Her impossibility of fulfillment became the heart of her myth, a sweet, devastating ache that deepened with every breath she took. Night had a way of softening every boundary around Kaguya-hime, wrapping the world in a hush that made each breath feel more intimate than words. On this particular night, the moon hung low and full, a pale lantern suspended just above the bamboo canopy, as though it had descended from the heavens to watch her more closely. The air carried a tenderness unusual even for summer, warm but threaded with a faint chill, like the last breath before dawn. Fireflies drifted lazily through the garden, their light flickering in slow, unhurried rhythms, as if echoing the pulse she tried so hard to steady. She had not expected him to come. She had tried to avoid him all day, sensing the thrum of longing beneath her skin whenever she thought of his voice or the quiet way he listened to her. But the pull of the moon had grown stronger with each hour, clouding her thoughts with a mixture of yearning and dread. She feared that seeing him would make the ache in her chest unbearable, yet the night, in its boundless tenderness, brought him to her regardless. She sensed him in the garden before she heard his footsteps. The bamboo leaves rustled faintly, acknowledging his presence with a softness she recognized. She turned toward the sound, letting her breath settle, smoothing any tremor from her voice before she spoke. "You shouldn't be here so late," she whispered, though her heart warmed at the sight of him. He stepped into the moonlight, and for a moment she saw him not as the gentle young man who had kept her company through so many quiet afternoons, but as a figure illuminated by destiny's cruel kindness. His eyes carried an emotion too deep to hide, a mixture of longing and sorrow that made him seem both fragile and brave. He admitted, "I couldn't sleep. Not tonight." She lowered her gaze, suddenly aware of how the moonlight clung to her skin. It was brighter than usual, outlining her in a faint aura she could not conceal. He noticed it too. She saw the flicker of awe in his eyes, but for once he did not retreat or bow his head. He simply stood before her, letting the truth of what he felt settle unspoken between them. The wind shifted, brushing a strand of hair across her cheek. He took a hesitant step closer, and for a heartbeat she did not move. The space between them thinned until she could feel the warmth radiating from him, a warmth that tangled with her own in delicate waves. She had never stood so close to him before, not like this, not with the moon watching her as though ready to reclaim her the moment she faltered.
Kaguya, he breathed, her name trembling through the night air like a confession. I know I have no right to ask you for anything, but if this is the last time we stand like this, let me be near you. His voice, soft and unguarded, slid into her chest like a warm current. She knew she should turn away. She knew every second she allowed herself to stay would only deepen the ache she would soon have to sever. And yet, standing before him with the moon heavy above her, she felt a part of herself yield, slightly, briefly, dangerously. "Just for tonight," she whispered. It was an invitation crafted from longing and resignation, fragile as the glow of the fireflies drifting around them. He stepped closer until their breaths mingled in the cool night air. He didn't touch her, not at first. He simply stood there, gazing into her eyes with a tenderness that unraveled the careful distance she had held for so long. Slowly, with a reverence that made her chest tighten, he reached out, hesitant, offering her every chance to refuse. His fingertips brushed her sleeve first, testing the boundary, then drifted lightly toward her hand. When his fingers finally touched hers, the contact was feather-soft, barely a whisper against her skin. She felt heat bloom through her, delicate yet overwhelming, like the first rays of sunlight after a long winter. Time seemed to pause. Even the fireflies stilled. Suspended like drifting stars, she felt the tremor in his hand, the warmth he tried to contain, the silent plea he dared not voice. And for a single, impossible moment, she allowed herself to imagine a life where she could choose him, where she could lean into his touch, where the moon held no claim on her heart. He stepped closer still until she could feel his breath against her forehead, slow and unsteady. She lifted her face to him without quite meaning to, drawn by something deeper than desire, a yearning for closeness she had denied herself since the night she first arrived on Earth. His other hand rose, fingertips brushing her sleeve with exquisite gentleness. The warmth of his skin melded with the cool shimmer of her celestial aura, and for that one suspended moment, she felt human. "Kaguya," he murmured again, voice thick with emotion. "Why does it feel like you're slipping away?"
She wanted to answer him. She wanted to tell him everything about the moon's pull, about the destiny she could not outrun, about how every moment with him felt like a stolen fragment of a dream she was never meant to have. But when she tried to speak, her throat tightened, and only a breath escaped her lips. He leaned in, not daring to cross the final distance, hovering close enough that she felt the warmth of him envelop her. She closed her eyes, letting the night press gently around them, letting his presence fill the space she had guarded so fiercely. It was not a kiss, but it felt like the memory of one, soft, fragile, trembling with everything they could not have. His forehead brushed hers, and she inhaled sharply, feeling the world tilt. The scent of pine, earth, and summer wind wrapped around them. His breath mingled with hers, forming a rhythm that made her chest ache with the sweetness of it. Every sensation, every heartbeat, every whisper of air felt amplified, luminous, as though the moon itself were holding them in its trembling palms. "Sometime," he whispered, voice cracking, "tell me how to reach you." Her eyes opened slowly, and she met his gaze, eyes shining with desperation, love, and the fear of losing something he had never truly held. She lifted her hand to his cheek, letting her palm rest there with a tenderness that felt like surrender. "You can't," she whispered. He closed his eyes, leaning into her touch, breathing her in as though memorizing her essence. The warmth of his skin seeped through her fingertips, grounding her in a way that both comforted and shattered her. Then, without warning, the moonlight intensified. A glow surged from her skin, soft at first, then brighter, too bright. He opened his eyes, startled, stepping back instinctively as though touched by something divine. She stood bathed in silver radiance, her silhouette delicate, ethereal, trembling with the weight of destiny. Kaguya, he breathed, fear threaded through her name. She reached toward him, but the light pulsed again, pulling her hand back as though tethered to the sky. The illusion of closeness shattered like a fragile shell. The space between them expanded, filled with the cold certainty of what could never be. The fireflies scattered, the wind rose, the moon called her. And their moment, beautiful, aching, impossibly tender, broke.
The night her fate finally reached for her began without warning, as though the sky itself had been holding its breath for centuries and had chosen that single moment to release it. A strange hush drifted across the bamboo grove, soft yet absolute, the kind of silence that made even the wind hesitate. It slipped over the land like a thin veil of moonlit frost, touching leaves, rooftops, and hearts with an otherworldly coldness. Those who had watched Kaguya-hime with longing, fear, reverence, or a devotion too deep to name, felt the shift instantly. They sensed something tightening around her, something invisible yet immovable. It was not tragedy in its loudest form, but tragedy in its gentlest, quiet, inevitable, and unbearably final. Kaguya-hime stood at the edge of the grove, her pale sleeves drifting like mist around her, and for a moment she looked almost mortal in her hesitation. Her gaze moved slowly along the familiar world she had softened merely by existing within it. The fireflies that glowed brighter near her, the bamboo that seemed to lean toward her in subtle devotion, the earth that held its breath beneath her feet. Nothing in her expression suggested fear, only acceptance, and a sorrow so serene it seemed carved from the moonlight itself. Behind her, the old bamboo cutter's footsteps faltered. He had always watched her with paternal tenderness, but tonight his voice trembled as though his heart were dissolving inside him. "Kaguya, child!" The rest of his words broke against the silence. He reached out, but did not touch her. He knew, with a painful certainty, that she was farther away than she appeared. She turned toward him, her face illuminated not by the moon above, but by some deeper radiance rising within her. It softened her eyes into shimmering pools, as if she were holding the reflection of the night sky inside them. "Father," she whispered, though she had never called him that before. The word itself became a blessing, pressed gently into the world. "Thank you for giving me a home in a place where I was never meant to remain." He bowed his head desperately, his tears falling without restraint. For all his years of caring for her, he had never touched the loneliness she carried, nor pierced the fragile aura that surrounded her. And yet he had loved her in the purest way he knew, quietly, without asking for anything in return. That love was breaking him now, slowly, like light fading from a lantern's wick.
From the shadows, other figures gathered, men who had once sought her hand with extravagant promises and impossible quests. They had failed, yet the longing she stirred in them had never entirely faded.
Now their faces were pale with dread, for the moment they had never prepared themselves for had arrived. Seeing her poised in the moonlit stillness, they felt that old, familiar ache, the one that always hovered between desire and despair. But tonight it was sharper, tasting of finality. One of them stepped forward, falling to his knees in the dirt. "If the heavens are taking you," he said in a raw whisper, "take my heart with you. Leaving it behind will only make it suffer." She looked at him with a softness that felt like a caress. "Your heart will mend, because it is meant to remain on this earth. Mine was never allowed to stay." The simplicity of her words cut deeper than rejection ever could. The men bowed their heads, suddenly aware that the longing they had clung to for so long had never been a path to fulfillment, only a thread leading to a quiet, inevitable heartbreak. The emperor himself arrived last, dismounting with uncharacteristic urgency as soon as he saw her shimmering form. He had loved her differently from the others, less from desire and more from a quiet admiration, an almost sacred tenderness. He had sensed from the beginning that she did not belong entirely to this world, yet he had hoped in some silent corner of his soul that she might choose to remain for him. Now the truth pressed upon him with the heaviness of the night sky. "Kaguya-hime, must this truly be your path?" She smiled faintly, a fragile curve tinged with melancholy. "It has always been my path, though I tried to walk beside yours for a little while." He stepped closer, not to possess her, but to understand her one last time. "Did I ever touch your heart?" he asked quietly. Her gaze softened into something luminous and bittersweet. "You touched the part of me that wished to remain, but the moon claims the rest." The emperor closed his eyes briefly, accepting her answer with the quiet dignity of a man who knew that love sometimes meant stepping aside. When he opened them again, he bowed, not as a ruler, but as someone honoring a miracle he knew he would never encounter again.
A trembling glow began gathering around Kaguya-hime, delicate as the first frost, bright as the edge of dawn. It spread outward in a sigh of silver radiance, brushing against the bamboo, the earth, the hearts gathered around her. The air rippled with a soft hum, not quite music, not quite silence, something between the two, like an echo of a memory shared by the stars themselves. The old bamboo cutter, barely able to stand beneath the weight of grief, stepped forward as far as he dared. "Will you remember us?" he whispered. Kaguya-hime's expression softened into a sorrow that was almost maternal. "She will remember the warmth of this world and the way you made me feel human, even if only for a breath of eternity." As the light around her brightened, the figures of celestial attendants emerged, robed in white, faces serene, their presence both beautiful and chilling. They did not speak, yet their silent approach pressed upon the hearts of those present, like a tide pulling everything toward an unchangeable fate. They were not cruel, only detached, embodiments of the inevitability that had always shadowed Kaguya-hime's existence. She turned once last time to the world that had given her fleeting secrets, laughter she had tried to learn,
Sorrow she had tasted, longing she had reflected back without meaning to. For a moment, the night held her in a delicate balance, as if the earth itself hoped she might linger one breath more. Then her body rose, slowly, weightlessly, as though unmaking its ties to gravity. The silk of her robes fluttered around her like drifting petals. Her hair poured behind her in a dark cascade that shimmered with starlight. She lifted her hand in a gentle final farewell, not a gesture of abandonment, but one of gratitude touched by the faint ache of goodbye. The bamboo cutter collapsed to his knees, sobbing quietly. The once suitors bowed their heads in defeated reverence. The emperor stood still, letting the sorrow wash over him in silence, refusing to interfere with the path that was never his to alter. Kaguya-hime's form grew sharper in its brilliance, then softer, then distant, as though she were being folded into the moonlight itself. A trail of silver dust shimmered in her wake, drifting like the memory of a touch that lingers even after skin has parted. And then she was gone, lifted into the celestial radiance that had always been waiting for her, claimed not by cruelty, but by destiny, leaving behind a world forever changed by the brief, luminous miracle of her presence. The night exhaled, and the world, now dimmer and heavier, settled into a silence from which it would never fully recover.
They say that after Kaguya-hime returned to the moon, the earth did not immediately understand what had been taken from it. Dawn rose as it always had. Crickets sang their nightly hymns. Rivers continued their soft meandering through valleys and forests. But there was a subtle difference, so subtle that only hearts, not eyes, could perceive it. Something luminous had slipped away, leaving behind a silence that was not empty, but echoing, as if the world were holding the memory of a touch that had vanished too quickly. In that quiet, people began to understand impermanence not as a tragedy, but as a fundamental rhythm of existence. Love, beauty, longing, none of it remained, and yet none of it disappeared. All of it drifted through the air like faint moonlight, intangible yet ever present. The old bamboo cutter felt this most acutely in the nights that followed. He would sit outside his home, gazing at the moon with weary eyes, not to grieve, but to remember. He realized that Kaguya-hime had never belonged solely to him, yet the warmth she left behind still lived in the creases of his hands, in the softened corners of his heart. Her absence did not erase the tenderness she had taught him. It carved space for it to breathe. The emperor felt it differently. His love had always been quiet, almost reverent, and after her departure, it became a meditation rather than a wound. He walked the palace gardens alone, his fingertips brushing the petals of pale blossoms that bloomed in the moonlight. Each petal reminded him of the fleeting softness of her presence, of how something could be impossibly delicate and still powerful enough to alter a lifetime. He learned then that longing was not a hunger to be fed, but a flame to carry, gentle, steady, illuminating the chambers of the soul. The ache remained, yes, but it became a companion rather than a torment, teaching him that some desires were meant not to be fulfilled, but to refine the spirit. As for the common people, they spoke of her in murmurs around evening fires. Children grew up hearing her story not with sorrow, but with wonder, how a girl of unearthly beauty had walked among them for a fragment of eternity, transforming ordinary lives simply by existing. They wondered if she had ever truly left, or if she had dissolved into the moonlight that still draped the bamboo forests with such tenderness. Many believed the moon shone brighter after her return, its glow softer, more sorrowful, as though it carried the trace of her earthly breath.
Over time, the world realized that Kaguya-hime's allure had never been rooted merely in beauty. It was her impermanence, her fragility balanced against mystery, that captivated every heart she touched. She embodied the truth that the most profound desires are often those that remain just beyond reach. The ache she left behind was not a wound, but a reminder of how deeply humans can feel, even when they cannot possess. Her story became a mirror held up to the universal yearning that binds mortals together, the longing for something too radiant to be held, yet too precious to forget. And in this longing, people found themselves connected not just to her, but to each other. The bamboo cutter, sitting alone beneath the moon, felt a strange comfort in knowing that others across the land were gazing upward with the same wistful tenderness. The emperor, who once stood solitary in his sorrow, realized that he was part of a vast tapestry of hearts quietly pulsing with shared ache. Even the suitors who had once competed for her attention discovered humility and introspection in their defeat, understanding that desire could be transformative, even without fulfillment. Kaguya-hime's memory wove itself into the very fabric of the land. In the rustling of bamboo leaves, people felt the feather-light trace of her passing. In the first snowfall of winter, they sensed the cool whisper of her celestial breath. In the pale shimmer of dawn, they imagined her gaze, looking back at the world she had briefly touched. The earth did not cling to her absence. It carried her presence in subtler, gentler ways, learning that loss did not diminish love, but deepened it. Her return to the moon became a symbol of the cosmic decisions beyond human grasp, the destinies that intersect with earthly lives for mere moments before drifting away. And yet, that intersection, fleeting, fragile, incomplete, was enough to give meaning to the longing that followed. The celestial and the human had brushed against one another like two ripples crossing on a still pond, leaving behind a widening circle of reflection. People came to understand that beauty was most powerful when it could not be kept, that longing was most resonant when it knew its own futility, and that desire, when held tenderly and without possession, could become a form of reverence rather than greed. Kaguya-hime had never asked to be desired. She had simply been herself, a being of light pressed temporarily into human form. Yet her presence taught humans to search not for ownership, but for connection, to cherish the fleeting moments that shimmer between two hearts before time gently pulls them apart.
Even centuries later, when her name faded into legend and her footsteps became part of myth. The emotional truth she embodied remained. Lovers whispered her story when parting at dawn, finding comfort in knowing that separation, though painful, was woven into the fabric of existence. Poets invoked her name when writing of transient beauty, knowing that no metaphor captured impermanence as vividly as she did. Travelers paused beneath the full moon to close their eyes and breathe deeply, imagining her fragile radiance trembling somewhere far above. And in quiet nights, when the world seemed suspended between breath and sigh, some claimed to feel a faint touch of her, an indescribable sensation like moonlight brushing bare skin, delicate and cool, awakening a longing they could not entirely name. It was not her presence, not really, but the echo of what she had represented, that some forms of beauty exist only long enough to transform those who witness them. The bamboo cutter, long after his hair had turned white, would sometimes speak softly to the empty air around him, not out of madness, but out of devotion to the memory that had reshaped his life. He thanked her for teaching him that love did not need permanence to be real, that tenderness could live in the deepest places of the heart long after the one who inspired it had departed. He understood at last that he had not lost her. He had simply learned to carry her differently. The emperor, too, would walk beneath the moon in his final years, feeling no bitterness in its glow. His love for her had never been confinement, but expansion, opening him to a vastness he could not have found alone. He cherished the ache she left behind, knowing that it kept alive the part of him that had dared to reach toward something divine. And so the world continued on, changed in quiet ways by a girl who had been both too tender and too luminous to remain. Her story lingered, not because of its tragedy, but because of its truth. The heart grows in the spaces where longing stretches it. Beauty, emotion, loss, they braid together into a single shimmering thread that humans follow instinctively, even when they know it will lead them somewhere they cannot stay. In the end, Kaguya-hime became less a figure of myth and more a reflection of the ache that lives in every soul. The desire to touch something infinite, even if only for a breath. And though she returned to the moon, leaving the world dimmer, she also left it deeper, teaching it that absence too can be a form of light. For in the quiet she left behind, every heart discovered its own reflection, shimmering faintly like moonlight on still water, beautiful, unreachable, and eternal.